Hey, special educators. Welcome to Teach TaskBox Inspire, the podcast dedicated to making your job as a special education teacher easier by making your instruction more fun for you and your students. Inside each episode, you'll learn how to get the most use out of your task boxes in the classroom. I'm your host, Lisa Holiday from Chalkboard Superhero, a veteran special education teacher passionate about empowering you with purposeful teaching strategies, helpful tips and tricks, and other classroom management tools that will help you thrive in your role. Let's get started with today's episode. Hey there, special educators, and welcome back to another episode of Teach TaskBox Inspire. I'm your host, Lisa Holiday, and today we're diving into a crucial strategy that I've talked about before, but I feel like I need to talk about it again. Again and again, I'm going into classrooms and seeing these mistakes happen over and over and over again. And so now I feel like I just cannot stop talking about it. The prompt hierarchy and how to effectively fade these prompts. I know firsthand how easy it is to overprompt. Sometimes we just want to help our students succeed, right? But if we're not too careful, too much prompting can lead to dependence instead of growth. So today, I want to break down the different types of prompts, how to fade them appropriately, and what mistakes to avoid. So let's get started. All right, if you've been in special education for a while, you've probably heard of the prompt hierarchy, but if you're new, let me break it down for you. This hierarchy system is just a system that moves from the most intrusive prompts like full physical assistance. Picture you helping a student kind of walking over to their schedule, to the least intrusive like independent work with absolutely no help. So here's what this kind of looks like in action. Imagine this, full physical prompting. You are physically guiding the student through the task. So you are touching the student with both of your hands. Maybe you're walking that student over to their schedule area to kind of help out with that, or guiding their body to their lockers. That is full physical prompting. Partial physical prompting is you're kind of gently just tapping their shoulder, tapping their back. Maybe it's hand over hand. Maybe you're just moving their arm over slightly. Then you get into modeling. Modeling is when you are demonstrating the task before the student tries. So say you're teaching them how to zip up a coat, you're standing in front of them, you're saying, oh, watch me, and you're zipping up your coat, and they're just copying what you're modeling. Number 4 is gestural prompting. So gestural is just that. You're pointing or kind of motioning to the correct answer or the next step in something. So say they have to check their schedule across the room, you may be pointing over to the other side of the classroom without saying a word. Just that gesture is helping them to understand what they need to do. Number 5 is verbal prompting. That's when you give a verbal reminder or instruction. So if they needed to check their schedule across the room, you're saying, all right, go check your schedule. Number 6 is visual prompting. Now, these are probably the most used prompts. So you're using either a visual schedule or an icon or written instruction, something that the student has to use their eyeballs for, right? And the last thing, what we are all going towards is independent work. This is when students complete the task without that adult, right? So what is the goal? We want our students to move from that highest need, that full physical prompting, to being as independent as possible. We want to work ourselves out of a job. Now, you might be thinking, Lisa, my students need prompts. And yes, at first they probably do. But here's the thing. When we don't fade prompts, we accidentally create a reliance on them, especially if you don't have a plan in place to fade that prompt. So think about a student who's always been given verbal prompts to raise their hand before speaking. If we never fade that verbal prompt, the student may never develop that self-regulation to raise their hand independently. And I know some of you who are in inclusion right now know that student that we're constantly saying, Johnny, raise your hand, because they're blurting out the whole time. But if we don't fade that prompt, they're always going to rely on Johnny, raise your hand. They will always just blurt out the answer first. So that's why we use systematic prompt feeding, meaning we have to gradually decrease the level of support while still ensuring success. So this kind of builds that confidence and independence, right? So now you're like, all right, Lisa, you got me. How? How do we fade these prompts? You kind of have to do it in steps. So here are some strategies to do that. Number 1, move down the hierarchy. If you are starting with full physical prompting, then you transition to gestural, then verbal, and then to eventually visual or independent work. That is how you want to kind of move down the hierarchy. And the best way that I love doing this is I put a huge poster on the side of the room or the back of the room, or maybe it's on your lanyard so that people can refer to it all the time. But you need to be able to know how to move through the hierarchy. Number 2, use time delay. Instead of prompting immediately, wait a few seconds to see if the student can complete the task independently. So many times we want to help the student. So say, for example, you have a student with Down syndrome who is struggling and you say, okay, it's time to change to math or go line up for specials, and they're struggling. They're getting their stuff together and their books go flying all over the floor. Wait. Give the time for them to clean it up themselves or ask for help or do something. So often you have paraprofessionals and teachers who will rescue a student, come to their aid and say, uh-oh, you dropped all of your stuff. Oh, honey, let me help you. No, let them figure it out. They have to be able to problem solve. They either have to ask for help or ask a peer or do it themselves. Let them struggle. Or let them productive struggle. Number 3, provide reinforcement for independence. So celebrate those small wins. If a student is, dropping all of their stuff in order to get their stuff in their locker and they don't ask for help, they're not looking at you like they need help, they're just doing it on their own, reinforce that with, way to go, girl. I can't believe you did that all by yourself. Number 4, use visual supports instead of verbal prompts. We want to try to replace verbal instructions with visual cues as much as we can, like checklists, schedules, like little task boxes. Whatever those verbal prompts are, try to use visuals instead. It is so incredibly hard to fade verbal prompts over visual prompts. That's why it's a kind of lower on the prompt hierarchy, because we are human and it's human nature to talk, right? So we want to be able to silence a lot of those verbal prompts and resort to visual supports. The last one is to monitor and adjust. Every single student is different. Some might need more time with certain prompts before moving to the next level. But I'm telling you, I cannot explain in words how often I've gone into special education classrooms over the last 17 years and seen a student in September with full physical prompting and then again in June, still with full physical prompting. A child doesn't need hand-over-hand support all year long. They have the ability to grow and we need to help them get there. They have to be independent, right? So let's say you start teaching a student to wash their hands. You might start with that hand-over-hand assistance, but you don't want to end up in June with you still helping them hand-over-hand washing their hands. You want to fade into just kind of pointing to the soap or saying, wash your hands, or just pointing to the visual that says, that sequence to wash their hands, dry their hands, right? All right, so let's talk about some common mistakes teachers make. And I've seen this over and over and over. I've been in so many different classrooms. So overprompting. If a student can do part of the task on their own, let them. Don't jump in too soon. Another mistake I see is not fading fast enough. I just said this. So if a student is still relying on a prompt after several weeks or several months, truly evaluate why. Are they dependent or do we have them trained to wait for the help? They want adults' help. Maybe you have inconsistent prompting. If you have different staff members using different types of prompts with Johnny, it can be confusing for the student. So make sure that your team is all on the same page. And the last mistake I kind of see a lot is skipping the hierarchy. Some people move straight from full physical prompting to independence, and that really sets kids up for failure, and they'll say, oh, no, we got to go back to full physical prompting because they can't do it on their own. Well, hello, there are a lot more steps in between, so progress should be gradual. So to avoid using these mistakes, we want to make sure that we set them up for true independence. And that also means kind of training your staff to do this as well. They have to understand which prompts they're giving their students at which times. So let's talk real quick about a real life example. Let's call him Johnny. He struggled with independent work, and I mean struggled. He would just sit at his desk waiting for me or a para to tell him exactly what to do, how to do it. And at first, he needed full physical prompting to start any independent work task. But here's kind of how we evaded that prompt. First, we went to gestural prompts, so we just pointed at the task, which would help him get started. Then we introduced a visual checklist to kind of guide him. So first this, then this, then this. Eventually, we waited a few seconds before we would prompt him, and then he started completing the first step all alone. Over time, Johnny really learned to start these tasks without waiting for an adult, which was a huge win for his independence. So to wrap it up, prompting is an essential part of teaching students with disabilities, but we have to do it strategically. The goal is always independence. So by understanding the prompt hierarchy and using systematic fading, we can really help our students build confidence and success. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What strategies have you used to fade prompts in your classroom? You can send me a message on Instagram or leave a review in this episode. And as always, keep sharing and keep inspiring. Until next time, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Teach, TaskBox, Inspire. I hope you've gained some tips and motivation to fuel your week ahead. If you're ready to explore more strategies for empowering your students as independent learners, be sure to dive into my free training at chalkboardsuperhero.com/training. And don't keep all this knowledge to yourself. Share this episode with your special education teacher friends who could use some motivation and inspiration. One more thing before you go. If you're finding this podcast helpful and want to show support, head to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review. Until next time, keep teaching, taskboxing, and inspiring.